When a white man throws a beer at Big Shaq and yells, "Go back to Africa," the town of Ashtonville freezes. But Big Shaq doesn't strike back. Instead, he stands silent, forcing the town to confront the hate it quietly hid for decades. One moment, one beer, one hateful slur, and suddenly justice was no longer about punishment, but about facing truths everyone chose to ignore. What unfolded next changed everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Ashtonville woke slow and golden every morning. The sun didn't just rise here, it strolled up lazily, spilling warm honey over front porches, dusty sidewalks, and rows of pine trees that whispered stories from the past. The cicadas were already humming by the time folks pulled open their curtains, the air thick with heat and a kind of southern patience that stretched long into the afternoon. It was the kind of town where people still waved at each other from porches, where barbershops doubled as therapy rooms, and the corner store clerk knew your daddy's name and your biggest mistake. But beneath that postcard charm, Ashtonville held something heavier, something most people didn't talk about until it made the paper, and even then, only in whispers. Shaquille O'Neal, known around here simply as Big Shaq, or sometimes just Shaq, walked these streets like he was born to carry the weight of them. He wasn't, but he carried it anyway, not because he owed the town anything, but because he saw what it could be, past the smiles, past the potholes, past the quiet side eyes that still followed some folks when they walked into the wrong diner. Shaq had money, sure, more than any man in Ashtonville. But what made people lean in when he spoke wasn't his millions. It was that he stayed, long after he could have left. After the endorsements, the arenas, the lights, he came back. He didn't come back to rest. He came back to work. By 7 a.m., Shaq was already at the community gym he helped rebuild last fall, after a storm peeled half the roof off. He wasn't sitting in an office or giving orders. He was lifting boxes of donated gear from the back of a rusted pickup, handing out sneakers to kids who couldn't afford them. The smell of fresh rubber and cheap floor polish clung to the morning air. He laughed big and easy, his voice bouncing off the brick walls like a drumbeat. He called every kid champ, not because he couldn't remember their names, but because he wanted them to believe it. Some did, some needed time. Behind the gym, the basketball courts buzzed with sneakers squeaking and trash talk. Shaq stayed close, offering tips without hovering. He never coached from a pedestal. He walked the same blacktop, wiped the same sweat. When a boy named Ravon shot an airball and dropped his head, Shaq didn't shout. He tapped the ball, passed it back and said, "Try again. Pressure makes diamonds." Ravon grinned, nodded, and tried again. Later that morning, Shaq stopped by Ruthie's cafe, where the biscuits were thick and the judgments thicker. It was the kind of place where men read newspapers like they were decoding enemy plans, and the women behind the counter could bless you and curse you in the same breath. Shaq always sat in the corner booth by the window, not to hide, but to watch. He liked seeing the town move, seeing who walked by, and who didn't. Some waved, some didn't. That was Ashtonville. Polite on the surface, calculating underneath. Ruthie poured his coffee without asking. She was the kind of woman who kept her hair pinned high and her secrets higher. "You still saving the world, Big Shaq?" she asked with a smirk. He smiled, but didn't answer. Sometimes silence said more than words. Across the street, a boy on a skateboard nearly collided with a deputy's cruiser. The deputy slammed the brakes and stepped out. The boy froze, tension twisted in the air. Shaq watched. Everyone did, but nothing happened. The deputy waved the boy off with a warning. The kid scurried away. Shaq stirred his coffee twice before taking a sip. Ruthie wiped the counter slower than usual. Outside, a breeze kicked up dust and yesterday's newspaper. One page flapped against the window before it was caught in a gust and sent tumbling down the sidewalk. But the headline was seared into Shaq's mind. Tensions rise over town council vote on diversity grant. It wasn't front page. It was bottom corner, small print, easy to miss if you weren't looking. But Shaq always looked. He knew what people chose to ignore said more than what they spoke aloud. By noon, Shaq was at the new youth center downtown, a project he funded when the old one was quietly shut down over budget concerns. It was modern, bright, and always full. Kids filled the art rooms, music echoed from the sound booth, and the air was charged with potential. Parents thanked him. Some were sincere, others said it out of obligation. One father, a man named Lowell Trent, shook Shaq's hand too hard, held it too long. There was something in his eyes that didn't match his smile. You got these kids dreaming big now, Lowell said, eyes narrowing. Just make sure you're still here when they fall. Shaq didn't flinch. That's why we build safety nets, he replied. Lowell grunted and walked away. In towns like Ashtonville, praise and resentment often rode in the same truck, side by side. Outside the center, a group of teens painted a mural. Shaq leaned in to admire the strokes. It was bright, abstract faces, colors bleeding together, fists and flowers both reaching skyward. One of the girls, Charlize, turned to him and asked, "You think they'll ever see us like this for real?" Her tone wasn't bitter. It was tired. Shaq knelt beside her. "They will," he said, "but only if we keep showing them." Not far away, in the town square, a group of men gathered near the old monument, the one with a soldier in stone, holding a rifle. They met there every Saturday, wore flag pins, spoke in slow, deliberate tones. They called themselves tradition keepers. One of them, a wiry man with deep creases in his face and a hat too clean for a working man, watched Shaq with narrowed eyes. His name was Ruth Creek. He had his own history, one the town rarely spoke of, but whispers had a way of circling back. That evening, the air cooled just enough to make front porches tolerable. Shaq sat on his mother Lucille's porch, sipping sweet tea and listening to the crickets compete with the radio. Lucille rocked slow in her chair, sharp-eyed and steady as ever. "They still scared of your size," she said without looking at him. "I don't give 'em a reason to be," he replied. "They don't need a reason, baby. Just an excuse." Shaq nodded. "You ever think maybe I'm wasting time here?" Lucille stopped rocking. "No," she said firmly, "because you ain't here for them. You're here for the ones still growing. They watch you." A silence settled between them. Not heavy, just thoughtful. The kind that came when two people knew too much and said too little. From down the block, voices rose. Not angry, just sharp. A neighbor arguing with her brother about a rent increase. The tension was always nearby, just not always aimed at you. That was Ashtonville. People held grudges like heirlooms, passed them down quiet, polished them in private. The next morning, Shaq walked into Johnson's Hardware to buy tools for a fence repair at the center. The clerk, Darren, greeted him flat. "Need anything else?" he asked with the enthusiasm of a man forced to say hello. Shaq smiled. "Nah, just building something that'll last." Darren scanned the items slowly. "Well, good luck with that." The air inside the store thickened for a moment, then cleared when the next customer stepped in. Shaq took his bag and walked out without looking back. But he noticed Darren had never charged full price before. He did today. Later that week, the town paper ran another small headline. "Local activist pushes for educational equity funds." Shaq's face was on the page, next to a blurry image of kids playing. He didn't ask to be called an activist. He just wanted better textbooks, but names had a way of morphing when they made people uncomfortable. That same day, whispers started in Dee's diner. A woman clutched her pearls and leaned across a booth. "I heard he's bringing in out-of-town folks to take over the school board." "No way," the other replied. "But if he does, that's how they do it. Quiet. Always quiet." That night, a light bulb popped in the gym hallway. Shaq replaced it himself. As he screwed in the new bulb, he noticed something written on the wall beneath the fixture in pencil. Faint. Almost scrubbed out. "You don't belong here." He stood there a moment, then walked to his office, pulled out a can of white paint, and brushed the words away. But the mark underneath? That stayed. Ashtonville didn't shout its hate. It whispered it, hid it in corners, wrote it in pencil and smiled while you read it. The warm sun kept rising. The kids kept playing. The court kept echoing. But in the stillness between footsteps, in the pauses after laughter, something shifted. A ripple. A glare. A name said too sharp. A compliment that stung. It was all leading somewhere, and Shaq felt it. Something was coming. The man shifted uncomfortably under Shaq's unwavering stare. The bravado that had propelled his actions began to wane, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He opened his mouth as if to speak again, but found no words forthcoming. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on him, on everyone. Around them, the townsfolk remained frozen, their faces a mosaic of emotions: shock, embarrassment, fear, and something else, complicity. No one moved to intervene. No one voiced condemnation or support. The weight of inaction settled heavily upon their shoulders, a collective burden that no one dared to lift. Shaq's mother, Lucille, stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. She knew her son, knew the depth of his restraint, the lessons ingrained in him from years of navigating a world that often saw his skin before his soul. Her heart ached, not just for him but for the town, for the festering wound that had been laid bare for all to see. Minutes felt like hours, as the standoff continued. Finally, Shaq took a deep breath, the rise and fall of his chest almost imperceptible. Without a word, he turned away from the man, away from the crowd, and walked toward the stage. Each step was measured, deliberate, echoing with the weight of a decision made, a choice to rise above, to not let hate dictate his actions. He reached the microphone, tapped it once, the sound reverberating through the stillness. The crowd remained hushed, anticipation coiling in their stomachs. Shaq scanned the faces before him, seeing the conflict etched into their features, the internal battles waging behind downcast eyes. "I came here today," he began, his voice steady but tinged with an undertone of sorrow, "to celebrate this community, our community, to honor the bonds we've built, the progress we've made together." He paused, allowing his words to settle, to seep into the cracks that had just been exposed. "But it's clear," he continued, "that beneath the surface, there are wounds unhealed, conversations left unspoken. Today was a reminder that our work is far from over." His gaze swept over the crowd, lingering on familiar faces, friends, neighbors, people he had laughed with, broken bread with. "I choose," he said, emphasizing the word, "to meet hate with love, ignorance with understanding. But that choice isn't mine alone. It's ours. We have to decide what kind of community we want to be, what legacy we want to leave for our children." He stepped back from the microphone. The silence that followed was different now, contemplative, introspective. Shaq descended the stage and walked through the crowd, which parted silently to let him pass. He didn't look back. The man who had thrown the beer stood alone now, the crowd having shifted away, creating a void around him. His earlier defiance had crumbled, leaving behind a shell of regret and isolation. He glanced around, seeking an ally, but found none. The silence he had instigated now enveloped him, a mirror reflecting his actions back at him. In the days that followed, Ashtonville grappled with the incident. Conversations that had long been avoided began to surface in hushed tones over fences and in grocery aisles. The community was forced to confront the undercurrents of prejudice that had been ignored, the silent complicity that had allowed them to persist. Shaq continued his work, his presence unwavering. He understood that change was a slow, arduous process, built on moments like these, painful, revealing but necessary. And as the sun rose and set over Ashtonville, casting its warm glow over a town in reflection, the silence began to break, replaced by voices willing to speak, to listen, and most importantly, to change. The next morning, the sun over Ashtonville rose just as golden, but it didn't feel warm. It felt clinical, too bright, like a spotlight someone forgot to switch off after the show ended. In the hours following the park incident, the entire town had folded in on itself like a newspaper after a brutal headline. No one said anything outright, but conversations had changed. Pauses got longer, smiles tighter, and everywhere Shaq went, eyes followed him a second too long. Not with admiration this time, but with questions no one had the courage to ask out loud. Shaquille O'Neal could have pressed charges. Everyone knew it. Some even expected it. A man had assaulted him publicly, used a slur that rang out like a gunshot across the town's collective image, and stood there with zero remorse. But when the sheriff's office asked what he wanted to do, Shaq didn't hesitate. "No charges," he said, his voice flat even, "but I want a hearing. Not in court, in town." That's when the ripples turned to waves. A community hearing? In Ashtonville, that kind of thing didn't happen here. Sure, they had town halls, mostly about zoning disputes and library budgets. But what Shaq was asking for was different. He wasn't seeking punishment. He was demanding a conversation, public and raw, about something most people here weren't ready to face. Town officials didn't hide their discomfort. Councilman Gordon Lang, a man whose tie was always too tight, and whose words were even tighter, called for a closed-door meeting to discuss protocol. Behind those doors, phrases like setting a precedent and not escalating matters echoed off the paneled walls. They spoke of optics, of consequences, of keeping the town unified. But what they meant, though none said it directly, was this. Shaq had upset the balance. Ruth Creek, the man at the center of it all, hadn't disappeared. He wasn't hiding. He sat smugly on his porch the next day, sipping cheap beer from a plastic cup, speaking to reporters with a voice that had traded its venom for rehearsed defiance. "It's a free country," he said. "Last I checked, I can say what I want. Ain't no law against having an opinion." When asked if he felt any remorse, his answer came without a blink. Nope. The media frenzy didn't take long to arrive. Ashtonville, once a dot on a map, was now trending online. Camera crews rolled into town like storm chasers, eager to capture a modern morality tale playing out in real time. Journalists asked townsfolk for soundbites, pushing microphones like probes into old wounds. Most declined. A few didn't. "He should have pressed charges," a woman at Ruthie's cafe muttered under her breath. "Letting that man walk free makes it look like he's okay with it." Across the table, her husband, a retired teacher, disagreed. "No, it's smart. Shaq's showing he's above it, keeping the peace." But peace wasn't what settled over Ashtonville. It was something more dangerous: ambiguity. At the gym, where kids still shot hoops and laughter still echoed, things began to shift. Parents hesitated longer during drop-offs. Some of the older teens whispered in corners, wondering if Shaq's silence meant weakness. One boy, Jameer, asked him directly, "Why didn't you fight back?" The question wasn't disrespectful, it was pleading. Shaq looked at him, a long, heavy stare, and said, "Because the fight's bigger than him." But even Shaq couldn't ignore the quiet questioning of his choices. He'd always believed in leading by example. But what example had he set this time? Forgiveness? Or surrender? The hearing was scheduled for the following week, reluctantly approved by the council, and reluctantly attended by almost every resident in town. Held in the old high school auditorium, the same one where Shaq had once spoken about youth empowerment, the atmosphere now was cold, wary. Chairs squeaked as people sat uneasily. The lights flickered once before steadying. A microphone waited center stage, not for speeches, but for truths. Waylon arrived early, flanked by his cousin Dale, and a few other men who wore the same kind of camouflage jackets that had never seen a day in the woods. He smirked at the crowd like a man who thought he'd already won. His defense? Freedom of speech. "I said what I felt. He don't like it. That's his problem." Shaq entered alone. No entourage, no fanfare. He wore a plain gray button-up and dark jeans. No suits, no symbolism. He nodded at familiar faces, some of whom couldn't meet his eyes. He sat near the front, not on the stage, not at a podium, just in a chair among the rest. The mayor, a woman named Eliza Cortland, with a reputation for playing it safe, called the hearing to order. Her voice was steady, but her fingers fidgeted with her pen. "We are here to hear concerns raised by Mr. O'Neal regarding a public incident that has deeply affected our community," she began. "This is not a trial. It is a space for understanding." The first speaker was a local pastor, Reverend Bryce, who talked about grace and reconciliation. His words were soft, carefully chosen, the kind that sought middle ground. Then came a teacher who spoke about the message being sent to students, how neutrality in the face of hate was itself a message. The gym's janitor, Miss Lenora, told a story about scrubbing the word ape off the locker room wall 2 years ago, and not reporting it because she didn't want to stir trouble. Then Shaq stood. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence settle, let the discomfort crawl. Then he said, "What happened in the park isn't just about me. It's about who we are when no one's looking. It's about what we let slide because we're too scared to confront the people we grew up with." He talked about fear, not his but theirs. How fear of conflict had allowed hate to bloom quietly. How the desire to avoid discomfort had silenced justice again and again. "I didn't press charges because I didn't want Waylon in jail. I wanted this town to look at itself in the mirror, and I wanted us to do it together." He turned to Waylon. "I don't want your apology. I want your honesty." But Waylon, arms crossed and face locked in a smirk, offered none. The crowd was split. Some nodded. Others remained stiff, unsure if Shaq had gone too far or not far enough. In the aftermath, the hearing didn't produce a resolution. There was no vote, no verdict. Just people walking out quieter than they'd entered, heads low, thoughts loud. For some, it was the start of a reckoning. For others, it felt like theater. Back at the gym, Shaq sat alone in his office later that evening. The silence was different now. Not heavy, but uncertain. His phone buzzed with messages from national leaders, athletes, even a senator who offered to amplify his cause. But he didn't respond. He didn't want this to be about clout. He wanted it to be about change. That night, someone left an envelope at the gym's front door. Inside was a note, typed, unsigned. It read, "You made him a martyr. Hope it was worth it." Shaq read it once, folded it, and slid it into the bottom drawer of his desk. He didn't mention it to anyone. It wasn't the first threat he'd received in his life. But it stung more because it came not in anger but in calculated warning. The next morning, local radio aired a call-in segment on the hearing. Most callers were hesitant, vague, but one, a man who identified himself as Dean from Willow Lane, said, "Shaq talks big about justice, but maybe he just doesn't want real consequences. Maybe he's protecting his image, or maybe justice don't apply when you've got millions." The comment lit up the lines. People started asking a question no one had dared whisper before. Was Shaq too soft? That question lingered. It wasn't just about Shaq anymore. It was about what kind of justice Ashtonville really believed in. The kind that punished, or the kind that reformed. The kind that made examples, or the kind that made progress. Shaq didn't answer that question directly. He just kept showing up. At the gym, at the community center, at the school board meeting. When asked by a journalist whether he regretted not pressing charges, he replied, "I regret that it happened at all. But I don't regret how I responded." Behind closed doors, though, Shaq wrestled with it. He wondered if he'd made the right call. He thought about Jameer's question, about the envelope, about Lucille's voice in his head, reminding him that real justice rarely makes headlines, but it always leaves scars. Justice had been interrupted. Not denied, not dismissed, but paused, mid-sentence, mid-breath. The town didn't erupt, it frayed, quietly. But sometimes, that's how things fall apart, or begin again. The house at the corner of Fayette and Willow had stood through 4 hurricanes, 2 floods and 1 brief but fierce protest that left chalk messages all over its walkway. It was the kind of home that wore time like a badge, shutters a shade lighter than they once were, porch swing chains creaking just slightly. A flag faded from sun but still flying. Inside, Lucille O'Neal moved through her morning ritual, with the same quiet strength that had carried her through decades of mothering, mentoring, and managing things no one dared say out loud in Ashtonville. The kettle hissed softly on the stove as sunlight streamed in through linen curtains, spilling across the kitchen counter. Lucille stood in her robe, stirring a pot of grits with steady hands. On the radio, a gospel station played an old hymn, slow and steady, its words folding into the rhythm of her movements, like background breath. The town was talking, buzzing like hornets under a cracked jar, but Lucille's kitchen was calm, not because the storm hadn't reached her, but because she had weathered worse and stood tall after. She knew her son. She knew his silence wasn't weakness, it was war. The kind fought behind the eyes and through clenched teeth, in boardrooms and backrooms, in the decision not to react, when the whole world expected you to explode. She had taught him that dignity wasn't just a shield, it was a weapon, a harder one to master than any punch or roar. Dignity, she'd told him once, is what you carry when they try to strip everything else away. But even the strongest armor cracks, and she saw the lines forming in him. When Shaq arrived at the house that afternoon, she didn't ask if he was okay. That kind of question didn't exist between them. Instead, she handed him a plate of cornbread and said, "Eat while it's warm." He sat at the kitchen table, filling the room with his frame but not his voice. His eyes were distant. She noticed the way he held the fork tight. Not angry, just bracing. "You still thinking about that man?" she asked, pouring him iced tea. Shaq didn't look up. "It's not about him. It's about what he reminded everyone of. What they work hard to forget." Lucille leaned against the counter, reminding people, don't sit well in a town built on pretending. There was a pause, full of unsaid things. Then she added, "But you handled it right." Shaq's jaw twitched. "Feels like I handled it alone." Lucille crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You weren't alone. You had me. You always have me. And you had every boy in that crowd watching how to walk away stronger than you came in." She sat across from him now, folding her hands. "When your uncle Elijah got spit on in uniform, you know what your granddaddy told him. He said, 'Don't let them make you hate what you're made of. That's how they win.'" Shaq nodded, the words landing deeper than he let on. That was the gift and curse of Lucille. She knew how to deliver wisdom like medicine. It didn't always taste good, but it always healed something. Across town, Another mother sat by a window. Ruth Creek. Her house was smaller, darker, cluttered with framed memories and knitted regrets. She'd been a widow for nearly 15 years, and the silence in her home had turned into a presence of its own, filling the rooms where laughter used to live. Ruth was a churchgoer, a firm believer in routine, but lately even the sanctuary had stopped feeling like shelter, because she knew, deep down, under layers of pride and prayer, she knew Waylon hadn't become that man overnight. She remembered the first time he'd come home red-faced after school, maybe 9 years old, complaining about some boy who took his seat. That boy had been black. Ruth had corrected him gently, insisted that seats belonged to no one. But her late husband Douglas had said nothing, just kept reading his paper. And when Waylon started making offhand remarks in high school, little jokes with hard edges, Douglas had chuckled. That's when Ruth stopped correcting. She remembered the moments when she chose silence over conflict, chose dinner peace over moral war. And now her son was the face of a town's shame. And what haunted her most wasn't what he'd done. It was how unsurprising it felt. She looked out the window, saw the world still turning, and hated how normal it looked. She turned from the view, shuffled to her writing desk, and opened an old drawer. There, buried under tax documents and faded greeting cards, was a letter she'd never sent, a letter she'd written to Shaquille's mother after his first donation to the Ashtonville school board. She'd meant to thank her for raising a son who gave back even when the town didn't always deserve it. But she'd never mailed it. Pride had stopped her. Now regret unlocked her hand. She pulled out a blank sheet, sat down and began again, not as a formality, but as confession. Lucille, I'm writing to you not as one mother to another, but as a woman who knows she failed to stop a fire before it grew legs. Back at Lucille's home, Shaq stood to leave. She stopped him at the door. You'll get called too soft. You'll get told you should have hit back. But don't let them make you smaller just to prove you're strong. He hugged her, holding tighter than usual, and she held him back like only a mother could, with forgiveness, with power, with everything she'd never said but always meant. The next Sunday, both women sat in their churches, less than 6 blocks apart. Lucille sat near the front, flanked by elders who sang hymns like they were casting spells for survival. Ruth sat alone in a back pew, eyes downcast, her Bible open but unread. The sermons were different, but both women prayed for the same thing, for their sons, one to heal, one to change. Word began to spread that Ruth had written something. No one knew what, just that she had passed an envelope to the mail clerk downtown and walked out without saying a word. By Monday, that envelope sat in Lucille's mailbox. When Lucille opened it, she read the letter twice before folding it carefully. Her eyes stayed on the last line. We teach them how to fight. Sometimes we forget to teach them how to stop. That evening, Lucille picked up her phone. She didn't call. She didn't text. She sat down with her own paper and pen, the kind of old-fashioned grace that matched her generation's pride. She wrote back. The town didn't know this exchange happened. There were no press releases, no social media posts. But something shifted. Tension, old, rooted, thorned, began to loosen its grip on the soil. When Lucille next saw Shaq, she didn't mention the letter. She just made his favorite sweet tea, asked him to fix the squeaky fence out back, and said, I think some folks in this town are finally ready to tell the truth. Don't waste it. He didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded. And across town, Ruth Creek stood on her porch at sunset, watching the sky bleed orange, thinking, maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for things to be different. Even for her son, even for her, because mothers know. They always do. The bells above the door at Dean's Market always jingled twice, once when you stepped in, and once when you passed the threshold of judgment. It wasn't the kind of place people hurried through. Folks strolled the aisles like they were walking memories, running fingers along cans of pinto beans, frozen pies, and shelves of cleaning supplies like it meant something more than the errand itself. But ever since the hearing, ever since Waylon's beer can had pierced more than Shaq's shirt, the store didn't feel the same. Not to him, not to anyone. Shaquille O'Neal had shopped at Dean's for years. Not because it had the best prices, or because he needed to. He could have had groceries delivered from the next county or flown in from LA, if he wanted, but because it was important to show up in everyday spaces, to be present in the rhythm of the town, to nod at the cashier, to joke about the overripe bananas, to be familiar. Now, as he walked through the automatic doors, pushing his own cart. The atmosphere crackled with something invisible, but thick. Eyes shifted but didn't hold. Conversations dipped to a lower register. Someone adjusted their cart trajectory to avoid his aisle. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. He passed the deli section, where Miss Connie usually offered him a taste of turkey with a wink and a joke. This time she didn't look up, just kept slicing like she didn't see the 7-foot shadow glide past her counter. At the end of the aisle, a young mother with a toddler in tow glanced at him, smiled nervously, and then glanced away when the older man beside her whispered something in her ear. When Shaq reached the checkout, the clerk, a high schooler named Joel, who used to wear Lakers gear every week, scanned each item like it weighed 10 pounds. Slowly, deliberately, avoiding eye contact as if it might be contagious. The belt clicked forward with a lag, and the beep of the scanner felt louder than the soft country music playing over the store's speakers. Shaq didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The air said it all. Outside, the sun was hiding behind thick clouds. The first time all week, he loaded his groceries in silence. As he closed the trunk, he caught sight of 2 women across the lot, standing outside their car, heads tilted toward each other in that unmistakable posture of gossip. He couldn't hear them, but he knew the rhythm, the glances, the half-nods, the loaded pauses. He'd grown up watching those same movements directed at his mother when she asked too many questions at school board meetings. Back home, he found an envelope tucked under the doormat. No name, no return address. Inside, a handwritten note. Some of us see what's happening. Stay strong. You're not alone. It was the 4th letter like that in a week. At first he'd been surprised, then moved. Now he felt something heavier. Because support that can't show its face isn't the same as standing beside someone in the light. Still, he kept each letter, filed carefully in an old cigar box in his office, next to photos from the gym opening and news clippings about his scholarships. Reminders that change never came all at once, and that some people didn't know how to stand tall until they saw someone else do it first. The next Sunday, Shaq didn't receive a single church bulletin in the mail. No invitation from Mount Grace. None from New Spirit Fellowship. Even the small Bible study group he sometimes dropped in on had gone silent. Not a word, not a text, as if spiritual spaces had chosen neutrality. Or worse, indifference. But Lucille noticed. Over sweet tea on the porch, she asked, "You going to church Sunday?" Shaq shook his head. Didn't get asked. Lucille didn't flinch. "You don't need no invitation to talk to God." Shaq exhaled. "It's not about that, Mama. It's about what their silence says." She nodded. "It says they scared of the truth. It says they still choosing comfort over courage." Meanwhile, in other corners of town, lines were being drawn, but not with words, with distance. Mr. Hallow, who used to wave at Shaq every morning on his walk, now just sipped coffee behind the curtain. The barista at Java's spot, who used to write big man energy on his cup, now handed it over without a glance. It was subtle. That was the cruelty of it. No signs, no confrontations, just absence, just omission. At the same time, notes kept arriving. One tucked under his windshield wiper at the rec center. "What you did took guts. Keep going." Another slid through the gym's mail slot. "Wish I had your strength. Still working on mine." But none were signed. Not one. That was the kind of protest Ashtonville knew best. Quiet, behind curtains, in whispers. Even the children began to sense the shift. At the gym, Jameer stopped Shaq mid-practice and asked, "Why ain't nobody saying nothin'?" Like for real. His voice was raw, frustrated. Shaq knelt to meet his eye level. Sometimes people think silence keeps them safe. But silence has a way of choosing a side. Jameer frowned. "So they ain't with us?" Shaq didn't answer. He didn't need to. Behind the whispers and glances, Shaq knew the town was testing him. Testing to see if he'd change, if he'd shrink, if he'd eventually walk away. But he didn't. He showed up every day, helped fix a leak in the locker room, ran drills with the kids, even organized a canned food drive when no one else would. Still, the whispers grew. At the hair salon, "He's too political now. Used to just play ball and smile." At the bank, "Bet this whole thing's part of a bigger agenda." At the diner, "He's making good folks feel bad for just living their lives." The town hadn't turned on him. Not exactly. But it had recoiled, like it didn't want to look at the truth he'd forced into the open. People didn't want to hate him. They just wanted to go back to before. But before was gone. One night after a particularly long day at the gym, Shaq sat on the back steps of his house and opened another envelope. This one was longer. The handwriting careful, the words more personal. I teach at the high school. I remember when you came to talk to the seniors. You told them they mattered. You told them not to wait for the world to get ready for them. I want you to know some of us heard you. I can't speak up yet, but I see you, and I'm proud. Shaq read it twice, then tucked it into the box. The next morning he walked into Dean's Market again. Same door, same jingle, same eyes. He filled his cart, paid in silence, left in silence. But as he stepped out into the sunlight, something different happened. A little girl tugged on her mother's hand and pointed at him. The mother didn't pull her back, didn't whisper. She smiled. Say hi, she encouraged softly. The girl waved. Hi, Mr. Shaq. Shaq smiled wide, tipped his cap. Hey there. One wave. That was it. But sometimes that's all it takes to break a silence. The gym was surrounded by reporters before breakfast. He hadn't asked for this. But now it didn't matter what he wanted. The town's dirty seams had been pulled apart, and there was no stitching them back quietly. News anchors called it a reckoning in the Deep South. Headlines ran phrases like racial tensions reignite in small-town America, and legendary athlete caught in the eye of a moral storm. Everyone wanted a quote, a reaction, a response. Shaq gave none. Because what do you say when proof finally lands but no one's really surprised? At the town hall, things went tense. Mayor Cortland stood behind her usual podium, visibly shaken, cheeks drawn tight. She addressed the press first, denying knowledge, then offering an apology if her actions were misinterpreted. She didn't deny clapping, just reframed it. It was a tense day, she said. I was applauding community involvement. I didn't catch everything Wayland said. But the footage told a different story. The crowd's silence had been thick, but her approval had been unambiguous. Citizens gathered in front of City Hall holding handwritten signs. Not the masses, just enough to be noticed. Truth matters, one read. Another, we were there. We remember. The whispers in the grocery store turned to side conversations on porches. Now everyone had an opinion. Now everyone had something to say. The local paper ran a retrospective the next day, highlighting the town's long history of quiet deflections. It pointed to other moments. A library event canceled in 2014, due to weather, when a black author was scheduled to speak. A teacher removed for teaching civil rights literature without approval. Each event, a stone in a wall they'd built around themselves. Lucille called Shaq that afternoon. You all right? She asked. Shaq paused. No. But I will be. She was quiet. Then, this ain't about them anymore. Not the town, not the mayor. It's about what the truth does when it breathes. That night, Julius outed himself. Posted a video on the same account. His face, bare and fearless, stared into the camera. My name is Julius Cade. I found this footage. I uploaded it. I'm not sorry. His voice was calm, unwavering. I've lived in Ashtonville my whole life. I've watched people talk about progress while holding on to the past like a secret. I didn't do this to hurt anyone. I did this because I'm tired of pretending. The video hit harder than the footage itself, not just because of the courage, but because it came from someone too young to have been part of the original story, but bold enough to change its ending. Wayland, meanwhile, remained silent. He refused interviews. He didn't post, but his lawyer issued a brief statement. Mr. Creek cannot be held responsible for opinions expressed during a public event over a decade ago, nor should past remarks be used to crucify current citizens. But the damage wasn't about legal culpability. It was moral exposure, and exposure left no one unmarked. Shaq finally addressed the media 3 days later, not with a press conference but through a letter handwritten, photographed, and posted online. I didn't bring this video forward. But it doesn't shock me. What shocks me is how long people were willing to pretend they hadn't heard things like this before. I've heard them. My family's heard them. We just kept moving. But maybe now's the time to stop. To turn around. To look at the foundation and ask what it's made of. Maybe it's time to rebuild. Not out of shame, but out of honesty. And if Julius Cade, a high school kid, had the courage to start it, what excuse do the rest of us have? The message exploded across social platforms. Celebrities shared it. Activists praised it. Political leaders tried to align themselves with it. But Shaq didn't engage. He kept his head down, kept showing up at the gym, took a call from Julius, and said simply, "You did good, man." At Dean's Market, The whispering had stopped. Now people just looked away. It was no longer about suspicion. It was about shame. At the next town council meeting, 2 members resigned. At the one after that, someone finally asked the question out loud. Should Mayor Cortland step down? No answer came that day. But it had been said, in public, in front of a crowd. The town's mask had cracked. Not fallen. Not shattered. But the first fracture was enough. And fractures spread. The studio lights were colder than expected. But Shaq didn't flinch under their brightness. He sat tall, his frame wrapped in a charcoal blazer over a soft gray shirt. No tie. The set was minimal. Just 2 chairs, a glass table between them, and a backdrop of blue hues designed to be calming, professional. Opposite him sat Carmen Devlin, the kind of journalist who didn't smile too easily, didn't ask permission to go deep, and never wasted airtime. America watched her at 8 p.m. sharp, 5 nights a week, trusting she'd press where others politely tapped. This interview wasn't planned. It hadn't been negotiated months in advance, or wrapped in PR spin. It had happened because the footage, the silence, the letters, the grocery store stares, and Julius Cade's viral video had built a wave too large to ignore. Carmen didn't want a statement. She wanted a reckoning. And Shaq agreed to sit down. Not for headlines, but because he'd grown tired of watching the narrative twist without him. We're live in 5-4, the producer's voice called out, fingers counting down as a red light blinked on. Carmen began with a warm, practiced tone. Good evening, America. Tonight I'm joined by Shaquille O'Neal, not as a sports icon but as a man at the heart of a small-town firestorm, with national impact. Shaq, thank you for being here. He nodded once. Deliberate. Thanks for having me. The first few questions were familiar. What happened at the park? Why he chose a community hearing instead of legal charges? What it felt like to stand alone while beer dripped down his shoulder. He answered steadily, without dramatics, each word purposeful. But the room changed when Carmen leaned forward, voice dropping just slightly. Shaq, you didn't retaliate. You didn't shout back. Some called it restraint. Others called it softness. I want to ask, what held you still? Shaq looked past her for a moment, not searching for the camera, but for memory. Then he spoke, quiet and slow. I was 11, he began, riding in the back seat of Coach McDaniel's truck. We'd just finished practice, and he was giving me a ride home. I had grass stains on my shorts, a broken shoelace, and a head full of stats. That's all I was thinking about, football, Gatorade, and maybe a cheeseburger. He paused. Carmen stayed silent. We got pulled over. 2 cruisers. No reason. No speeding. Just pulled over. One cop walked up on my side, hand resting on his belt. Didn't ask for Coach's ID at first. Just looked at me and asked whose car I was in. I said, my coach's. He didn't like the answer. Shaq's voice didn't shake, but the chill in it was unmistakable. He asked me to get out. Coach McDaniel, white man, Vietnam vet, real quiet type, got out first, stood between me and the door, didn't yell, didn't cuss, just looked at that officer and said, this boy's mine today. If you got a problem, you take it up with me. A long breath.
They let us go.
No ticket, no apology, just gone, like nothing happened. Carmen didn't interrupt. The silence in the studio was total. I never forgot that. The way Coach didn't make it about heroism. He didn't wait to see if I'd break. He just stood there, solid, because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not move. He leaned forward now, tone tighter. So when Waylon threw that beer, when he said what he said, I remembered that moment. And I remembered that if I let his hate decide my next move, then I'd be playing his game. And I don't play games where everyone loses. Carmen's next question came softer. Did you want to hit him? Shaq didn't hesitate. Yes, a heartbeat. But wanting and doing ain't the same. Wanting's human. Doing's a choice. The segment played out in real time, but the reactions moved faster than light. Within minutes the clip was sliced, posted, retweeted, shared across every platform like a sermon for the digital age. The phrase "this boy's mine today" trended worldwide. Celebrities reposted it. Activists folded it into conversations about allyship. Parents posted stories of teachers, coaches, mentors who shielded their children without applause. But Ashtonville heard something else. They heard that Shaq's strength didn't come from silence. It came from survival. And they heard something unspoken too. That it could have gone differently. That it still could. The town's phone lines lit up. Viewership spiked. Local radio tried to keep up, fielding calls from folks who now claimed they always supported Shaq, even when they hadn't. But alongside the noise came something more damning. Whispers turned to leaks. Wayland Creek's former coworkers started speaking. Not in packs, not on camera, but one by one. First was Drew Malloy, who used to work with Wayland at the aluminum plant. He told a local reporter, off record, that Wayland had once refused to train a black temp worker, called him boy in the break room. Nothing happened. HR couldn't confirm. The temp left after 2 days. Then came Tina Holloway. She'd worked night shifts with Wayland at the auto body shop. He used to call Obama the African. Even when customers were in the room, she said. Said it like a joke. But it wasn't funny. The mayor's office issued a statement within hours, distancing itself from Wayland's history of inflammatory language. But the public wasn't buying it. A hashtag emerged, Ashtonville knew. Shaq didn't respond publicly. He didn't repost. He didn't appear on any more shows. He spent the next morning with Lucille, sipping coffee on the back porch, watching birds peck at the dew-covered grass. She handed him a newspaper, folded to a page with a column titled When Strength Looks Like Stillness. A photo of him from the interview was printed above it. He smiled faintly. You knew this would happen, he asked. Lucille shrugged. I knew truth don't stay buried long. Not if it's got people like Julius and Coach McDaniel out there. He tapped the paper. It's getting louder. She looked at him. Good. Maybe now folks'll start listening. By midweek, more stories surfaced. Some small, some damning. A contractor said Wayland refused to work jobs in certain neighborhoods. A school volunteer admitted he'd heard Wayland mock black parents behind their backs during PTA fundraisers. The pattern wasn't new, but now it had witnesses. Ashtonville was no longer debating whether what Wayland did was offensive. They were staring at the rot in their own house, exposed by a beam of light they never meant to switch on. And in the center of it all was Shaq, calm, grounded, unmoved. Not because he didn't feel the fire, but because he'd seen it before, and this time, he wasn't walking away. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, plain and cream-colored, addressed by hand, in careful cursive. No return address. No markings, except for the familiar scrawl. To Mr. Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq found it nestled between a stack of local mail, on the front counter at the gym, bills, donation requests, and flyers that boasted back-to-school sales, and 2-for-1 burgers at Dean's Market. He didn't think much of it, until he turned it over, and saw the small initials pressed into the envelope's seal. Lucille had told him she'd seen Ruth Creek walking toward the post office earlier that week. Head down, shoulders tense. She looked like she had something to unload. Lucille had said. Now Shaq knew exactly what it was. He didn't open it right away. He held it in his hand like it might sting. The town had been lurching toward this moment, one unspoken truth at a time. But this letter, this was a shift. A woman who had been silent when it was easier, who had stood in the background of her son's cruelty, was finally stepping forward. And she wasn't hiding anymore. He took it upstairs to his office, closed the door, and sat down at the heavy wooden desk. The early light streamed through the window, catching the paper's surface just right as he peeled it open. There were 2 pages, lined, torn from a notebook, not some polished stationery. That mattered. It made it real. He read it once, then again, then he sat still for a long time. Dear Mr. O'Neal, I don't know if you'll read this. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. I've spent most of my life watching things happen, and convincing myself they weren't mine to change. That ends today. My name is Ruth Creek. I am Wayland's mother, and I am sorry. The words were heavy, not just apologies but confessions. My husband Douglas died 16 years ago. People in town liked him, called him old school, hard-working. What they didn't know, or didn't want to see, was the anger he carried. That man believed in lines between people. Lines drawn by skin, money, name. He didn't teach Wayland to hate. He let it sit in the room like smoke, until my son breathed it in every day like air. I tried to soften it. I really did. I read books to Wayland when he was little. Stories with kids who didn't look like him. I took him to the county fair when the town tried to segregate booths and told them I'd go home before I stood in 2 lines. But the truth is, I didn't push hard enough. I didn't say stop when Douglas sneered at the news. I didn't pull Wayland aside when I should have. I kept peace in my house and lost the battle in my son. Shaq stopped reading for a second, took a breath. Then he continued. You should know something else. 5 years ago, Waylon came to me after he'd lost another job. He didn't tell anyone, but he applied to your mentorship program, the one you run at the community center for older men trying to re-enter the workforce. I remember that day, clearly. He was nervous, wore a clean shirt, even brought a resume if you can believe it. He never heard back. At first I assumed he'd been denied. Maybe for good reason. But a month later, I ran into one of the committee board members at church. We were talking about town projects, and I mentioned the mentorship. She looked at me and said, and I quote, "We couldn't risk putting him in front of Miss O'Neal. The optics would have been terrible." Turns out Waylon's application never even made it to your desk. Someone decided he wasn't worth the risk. They didn't give him a chance to try. I don't tell you this to excuse him. I tell you because you deserve to know. The town failed him too. Shaq leaned back in his chair, the letter dangling from his hand. Of course, it made sense. He remembered the year, remembered asking why the applicant pool had dropped off so suddenly. The paperwork, the filters. He had trusted the system, and the system had quietly decided who deserved a seat at the table. Waylon has become something I struggle to recognize. That hate, he owns that. But it didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of people patting him on the back when he barked loud, and pushing him aside when he tried to stand tall. He learned to bark louder, until I am not writing to protect him. I am writing to stop protecting myself. I've sat in the pews of my church, and nodded through sermons about forgiveness, while letting bitterness run under my skin. I've smiled at your mother in passing, and never said what needed saying. So let me say it now. You were right to hold your peace. You were right to not strike back. You did something none of us had the spine to do. You held a mirror to all of us, and waited. Well, here I am, finally looking. Ruth had signed the letter with a name that shook. Sincerely, Ruth Creek. A mother who waited too long. There was a second copy, tucked in a separate envelope, sealed but marked clearly, to the Ashtonville Chronicle, print if you dare. Shaq didn't hesitate. He picked up the sealed copy, slid on his jacket, and drove straight to the newspaper office. He handed it to the receptionist without a word. By the next morning, the letter had made the front page, not buried in the editorial section, not hidden beneath ads. Front page. Full page. Ruth's words burned across breakfast tables and coffee mugs, echoed in car rides to school, hung over shop counters like thunder waiting to strike. The town hadn't expected her voice. She was quiet, a background figure, a church lady, not someone who caused waves, but her truth punched harder than anyone else's. The town's collective breath hitched. Because for the first time, the narrative shifted. Waylon was no longer just the villain. He was something more dangerous. A product, a man formed not just by his own choices, but by a town that had turned away at every crossroads. The letter didn't redeem him, it revealed him. Some people recoiled. Don't make excuses for him. One diner regular snapped while reading over a plate of hash browns. Others softened. Makes you wonder how many others slipped through the cracks, said a teacher between sips of black coffee. A few grew angry, but not at Ruth, at themselves. At the realization that silence is rarely neutral. At the idea that in protecting comfort, they'd allowed corrosion. Julius Cade posted the letter in full, with the caption, "This is what accountability looks like. From a mother. From a town. From a past that's been ignored too long." The post went viral. Again. But Shaq didn't say much. He didn't post. He didn't parade Ruth's courage. He just showed up, same as he always had. At the gym. At the store. At the rec center, where he added a new question to the mentorship intake form. Have you ever been denied a second chance? Tell us why. One afternoon, as he sat in his office, Lucille stepped in holding a small envelope. More mail, she said with a knowing look. He opened it slowly. Inside was a note, 3 lines, printed in sharp block letters. Thank you for reading. Thank you for not hating him more than he deserves. Thank you for seeing me. No name. But no need. Shaq placed it with the rest. Then got back to work. It started with a flyer, simple, black text on a white sheet, taped to the windows of corner stores, pinned to church bulletin boards, slid under doors in apartment buildings, and tucked between windshield wipers like something sacred. No logos, no sponsors, just a line at the top that said, "For us, for now, for what's next." Underneath, Candlelight gathering, Friday 8 p.m. Outside Shaq's gym. No speeches, just No one claimed to have created it. But somehow, it reached everyone. By the time the sun dipped behind Ashtonville's tree line that Friday, the town had shifted into a strange hush. The grocery stores closed early. The gas stations dimmed their lights. There was no game at the high school stadium, no late-night band practice, no clinking of glasses from the downtown bar. People moved slowly through the streets, carrying umbrellas in one hand and candles in the other, their footsteps purposeful, their faces unreadable. Outside the gym, a steady gathering had already begun. Shaq stood in the entryway as the crowd thickened. First a few dozen, then over 100, then more than he could count. There were teenagers in Letterman jackets, older women wrapped in shawls, fathers holding their daughters on their hips, grandmothers handing out matches with fingers that had lit candles for more things than this town would ever know. And no one spoke. No podium, no microphones, no impassioned calls for unity. Just silence, the kind that says everything. Soft music played from a small Bluetooth speaker. Someone had set up at the base of the gym steps. Old soul songs hummed into the warm night air, crackling slightly like vinyl played on worn grooves. The kind of music you didn't need to recognize to feel. Shaq walked among them, greeting no one specifically but acknowledging everyone. A nod, a hand to a shoulder. A brief pause beside someone holding back tears. He carried his own candle, unlit at first, until a small boy with scraped knees and wide eyes offered his flame. Shaq leaned down, let the boy light his wick, and whispered, "Thank you, champ." The glow spread. One by one, flames flickered to life, passing from hand to hand, like breath, until the entire sidewalk outside the gym was bathed in a soft orange halo. It wasn't loud, it wasn't bright, but it was undeniable. Then the rain came, not hard at first, just a soft mist, then a steady drizzle. Someone in the back reached for their umbrella, but no one moved to leave. Heads tilted up, jackets were pulled tighter, candles were shielded with hands and plastic cups, but none went out. Not one. The storm picked up, lightning cracked in the distance, but it didn't come closer. The wind pushed sideways, but the people leaned together, forming a wall of shared weight and will. Shaq stood in the center of it, soaked to the bone, his shoulders glistening under the dim light. He didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He let the rain hit him full on, the way he had let the town's silence do the same. But this wasn't the same. This was something else. Lucille stood behind him, her candle in one hand, her other resting gently on her heart. She didn't need to say anything. She'd raised her voice in prayer and protest for years. Tonight, she just stood and let the light speak. Across the street, the mayor watched from her car. No press, no security detail. Just her, behind the wheel, engine off. She didn't join the crowd, didn't get out, but she stayed, and watched, and listened to a town choosing something else. Ruth Creek was there too. Near the back, hood up, candle in hand. A few people turned when they saw her, unsure of what to do, but she kept her eyes down, not in shame, but in reverence. This was not a place for ego. This was a place for presence, and hers was quietly accepted. As the hours stretched on, the candles stayed lit, even when the rain deepened, even when puddles formed around their feet, even when thunder grumbled like old history trying to have its last word. Shaq looked around and felt something rise, not pride, not vindication, but clarity. This was the town stripped of noise, of sides, of speeches. What remained were hands and candles, and soaked shirts and eyes that had finally learned to look directly at one another. Jameer stood close to Shaq, his flame cupped carefully. The boy didn't speak, but he looked up, and Shaq nodded. The kind of nod that meant, "You see it now, don't you?" And the boy nodded back. He did. At 9:30, someone began humming. No lyrics, just melody. Low, slow. Others joined in. A woman 2 rows back harmonized without trying. The sound swelled, not loud, but layered, like grief, like hope, like forgiveness trying to find a home. They didn't sing it like a hymn. They sang it like a promise. And when the rain stopped, suddenly, as if on cue, the candles still glowed, their flames steady, unbroken. People began to leave slowly, one by one, a few at a time, their footsteps light on the wet pavement. No one spoke. The air didn't need more words. Shaq remained until the last candle was placed in a mason jar beside the gym steps. He crouched, picked it up, and watched the tiny flame dance behind the glass. Then he looked up at the building, the community space he'd fought for, that had seen more than its share of quiet battles. And then he whispered, mostly to himself, the lights stayed on. Because they had. Not just the candles, not just the bulbs inside the gym, which had flickered through years of power outages and underfunding, and cut corners, but the people. The spirit. For the first time in a long time, Ashtonville wasn't holding its breath. It was breathing. The folding chairs were arranged in a circle. No platform, no desk, no podium, just chairs. That was the point. No one was above or below anyone else. No gavels, no guards, no robes or rules to hide behind. This wasn't a courtroom. It was the Ashtonville Community Center, the same building where kids learned to swim, where families picked up food boxes, and where, on that gray Tuesday evening, something more sacred than punishment was about to take place. Waylon Creek had not been arrested, not fined, not tried. His beer can assault, while filmed and circulated, had no courtroom follow-up, because Shaq declined to press charges. But Shaq had requested something else, something harder to walk away from. A circle. Restorative justice wasn't common in Ashtonville. It wasn't written into the town charter. It wasn't something most folks had ever witnessed outside of documentaries. But Shaq had studied it, quietly, carefully, and now he was ready to try it. The invitations were discreet. Each person who'd been impacted by Waylon's words, or the silence that followed them, was asked to attend, not for vengeance, not to scream, but to speak. At 6:02 p.m., Waylon entered the circle, escorted not by officers, but by the weight of his own choices. He wore a button-down shirt that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in months. His beard was thicker, his face tired, not from prison, but from isolation. He glanced around and saw who was already seated. On one side, Terrell Benson, a 17-year-old senior, honor student and basketball team captain. The boy who used to idolize Shaq, until the fundraiser, when he learned that even legends weren't safe. Mrs. Deborah Lantham, a middle school teacher, who taught literature and wept the day a parent demanded she remove To Kill a Mockingbird from her curriculum. Silas Boone, owner of the only black-owned hardware store in Ashtonville, who hadn't had a customer from the east side of town since the beer incident. Lucille O'Neal, present not to defend her son, but to bear witness. And then there was Shaq still, grounded, quiet as stone, seated directly across from Waylon. No police, no press, just truth. A facilitator named Colleen, brought in from the neighboring county, explained the rules. One person speaks at a time, no interruptions, honesty above all else. There would be no rebuttals, no cross-examinations, only stories, and once every person had spoken, Waylon would have his turn. Terrell went first. His voice was low, but steady. I saw the video on my phone while I was eating dinner. My little brother was next to me. He's 10. When he heard those words, he asked me what they meant. I told him, and then he asked if they'd ever say that to him, and I didn't know what to say back. He paused. I started skipping practice, not because I didn't love the game, but because I couldn't walk into that gym without hearing it in my head. What you said, what nobody did. Next was Deborah. I've taught English for 22 years. Every time I hand my students a story about injustice, someone says it's too political. When you stood in that park and said what you did, I realized how many people in this town would rather erase history than face it. I stopped assigning certain books after that week. I'm not proud of it, but fear changes people. Your words reached my classroom without ever stepping inside it. Silas didn't look at Waylon when he spoke. My business has been open for 18 years. After that fundraiser, my regulars disappeared. Said it wasn't personal. Said it was about not picking sides. But the silence was aside. Your words cost me money. But more than that, they cost me trust. From people I'd helped for years. Lucille didn't say much. I raised a son who knew when to speak, and when not to. Who understood that how you respond says more than what happened to you. But what I want you to know, Mr. Creek, is that there are mothers in this town raising boys who heard you. And some of them won't know how to carry that moment the way my son did. Then came Shaq. He didn't raise his voice. You stood in a park surrounded by children and threw hate like it was candy at a parade, and then you went home like it didn't matter. I could have fought back, could have pressed charges, but I wanted you to hear what came after the beer. Not from me, from them, because this ain't about me. He paused. But it is about you. And then finally, the room turned to Waylon. He held the talking piece in both hands, a smooth stone, etched with the word listen. For a long while he didn't speak, just breathed, slowly, like the words were still somewhere in his chest waiting to be unlocked. When he did speak, his voice surprised everyone. It wasn't loud, wasn't angry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I didn't come here looking for sympathy. I came because the only thing worse than what I did was pretending it came from nowhere. He looked at Shaq. I was angry that day. But not at you. A hush fell over the room. I was angry because I lost my job 2 months earlier. Not because of you, but because of a man named Hank Dyer. A few heads turned. That name wasn't unfamiliar. Hank was a councilman now. Owned several properties across Ashtonville. Well-respected. Church-going. Conservative. I worked on his property crew. Landscapes. Repairs. When he saw your name on the town grant for the community center expansion, he told me you were turning this town into Atlanta. He said folks like me needed to remind them who's really in charge. I didn't think much of it then, but the next week, he handed me a ticket to that fundraiser, told me to go enjoy the show. I didn't connect the dots. His hands clenched. But before I left for the event, I got a text from a number I didn't know. Said, make your voice heard. Some of us still believe. Waylon looked around. I'd had 2 beers already. I walked into that park feeling invisible. I wanted someone to see me, even if it was ugly, so I yelled. I threw. And when I saw Shaq just stand there, I felt smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. He swallowed hard. And when I got home, I texted that number back. You know what I got? He pulled out a phone and read from the screen. Good work. We'll be in touch. The room froze. Shaq leaned forward. You kept that? Waylon nodded. Because it scared me. Because I realized then that I wasn't angry. I was used. He set the stone down. I don't ask for forgiveness. I just want to start telling the truth. Even if I'm the villain in it. No one clapped. No one cried. The circle ended not with a resolution, but with a reckoning. Colleen closed the session, reminding everyone that healing was not a finish line but a process. Chairs were folded, lights dimmed, and as people walked out of the room, they carried with them something heavier than before. Not hatred, not judgment, but the burden of knowing how deep the roots of rot ran. Outside, rain threatened again, but this time, no one looked for cover. The patch of earth where it happened didn't look like much. Just a corner of Ashtonville Park where the grass grew unevenly and the trees leaned a little east from years of southern wind. Most days you could walk past it without noticing anything out of place. A few benches scattered near the walking path, a faded sign announcing park hours, and a trash can that always needed emptying. But for Shaquille O'Neal, that patch of ground had weight. Not because of what it looked like, but because of what it had held. It was where the beer hit him, where the words "Go back to Africa" tore through a crowd, where silence screamed louder than outrage. That spot had become something in his memory, frozen, thick, unresolved. And even though the town had moved on in its own uneven way, some people changing, some clinging tight, Shaq hadn't let go of it. Not yet. He didn't want a statue. Didn't want plaques or headlines or anything that resembled glorification. But he wanted something there. Something still. Something that told the truth without shouting. He wanted a bench. The wood came from his late uncle's old barn in Montgomery. Lucille had kept it stored behind the house, saved for something worth building. Shaq brought it to the center, stripped it, sanded it by hand in the evenings when the gym had quieted down. He didn't rush it. He wanted the bench to feel earned. He measured the legs, cut them carefully. Each board was smoothed until it felt like river-worn stone beneath the touch. He asked a local artist, a young woman named Nora Platt, to etch something into the backrest. He gave her the quote, one of Lucille's old lines, the one she said so often growing up. It had become a part of him. The strongest men don't raise their fists. They raise their people. She nodded, didn't ask questions, and delivered it 3 days later, carved deep, not for drama but for permanence. Shaq installed it himself one Saturday morning. No ceremony, just him and 2 volunteers from the mentorship program, digging holes, leveling legs, brushing dirt from their jeans. When it was done, he stood back, hands on hips, looking at it like it might speak. It didn't, but it didn't need to. The next day, a man walking his dog sat down on it. Just for a moment. Didn't take a selfie. Didn't post anything. Just sat. Looked out at the field. By Wednesday, someone had left flowers beneath it. Wild ones tied with a shoestring. Friday afternoon, a group of fifth graders from Ashtonville Elementary showed up with notebooks. Their teacher, Miss Frey, explained they'd been assigned a writing prompt. What does strength look like without fists? They spent the next half hour sitting quietly, scribbling in silence. The bench had no plaque, no explanation. But word spread. Local newspapers picked it up first, calling it a quiet monument. Then regional media arrived, photographing families sitting side by side on its narrow seat, watching the same place where the town had been forced to see itself. Tourists began visiting Ashtonville, not in busloads, but in ones and twos. A man from Baton Rouge, a woman from Des Moines who had read about it on a blog. One retired vet drove 6 hours just to sit on it for 20 minutes, said it felt like a place you think about the version of yourself you used to ignore. People asked Shaq if he'd be adding more, another bench, a statue, maybe a plaque naming Waylon. Naming himself, he always gave the same answer. Nope. One bench, that's all it takes sometimes. Lucille visited it every Sunday afternoon after church. She'd bring a book, sometimes a cup of sweet tea, and sit for an hour, watching families walk past. People nodded when they saw her. Some stopped to say thank you. She never responded more than she had to. Just nod. The quote was hers, but the silence was the town's to fill. Not everyone liked it. Some folks muttered it was a political prop, said it was a symbol of division. One night, someone left a folded note taped to the bench. You act like we didn't already move on. Shaq found it during his early walk and didn't even flinch. He tucked it into his pocket and went about his day. That night, he burned it in a tin can behind the gym. Some words didn't deserve preservation, but most did. Letters began arriving again. This time, not anonymous. One from a former student who'd grown up watching Shaq play, now a teacher in Missouri. She brought her class to Ashtonville on a field trip. They sat in a circle around the bench. No phones, no cameras, just stories. She wrote, "It's not about what was thrown, it's about what stayed." Even Waylon came, once. Shaq didn't see it happen, but Ruth told him, said he stood there for nearly 30 minutes. Didn't sit, didn't speak, just stared at the engraving. She didn't ask him what it meant. She didn't need to. When she passed the bench the next morning, there was a single folded page beneath it, weighted down with a stone. It was gone before noon. What changed wasn't overnight. The bench didn't wash the town clean, but it shifted things. Conversations in the diner lasted longer. The school board invited community members to share lived experiences before curriculum votes. New families moving in asked about the bench before they asked about property taxes. And for the first time in years, the town's history museum added a new section, Stories That Shaped Us. It included a picture of the bench, no mention of the beer, no headline, just the quote. One evening, Shaq sat on the bench alone, as dusk turned the sky lavender. The gym lights buzzed behind him. Kids' laughter echoed faintly from the basketball court inside. He leaned back, stretched his legs, and watched the breeze rustle the grass. Lucille joined him a few minutes later, holding 2 ice-cold teas. She handed him one. You did good. He took a sip. Still feels like not enough. She smiled. That's how you know it was honest. They sat in silence, shoulder to shoulder, as the sun dipped lower. The wood beneath them creaked softly, the same way truth does when you finally learn to carry it. And still the bench stayed. The invitation came on letterhead, so crisp it practically rustled like parchment. Gold seal, university crest, formal language written in the kind of clean serif font that only institutions with endowments use. Georgetown University. Keynote speaker. Annual symposium on American social transformation. They wanted Shaquille O'Neal, not as an athlete, not as a public figure, but as a voice, a witness, a man who had, in their words, held a mirror to his community and asked it to look longer than it was comfortable. Shaq didn't say yes right away. He'd never cared much for stages that required dressing up wounds as speeches. But Lucille read the letter twice, nodded, and said, "They're not asking for a celebrity, baby. They're asking for a soul." That, more than anything, got him on the plane. DC was all sharp suits and smarter rooms. When he arrived on campus, students buzzed with energy, holding phones, swapping links to the man who lit candles instead of fires. In the auditorium, lights beamed down on a polished podium, surrounded by ivy-draped banners. The audience was packed with professors, activists, journalists, and young faces still learning how to carry their convictions without burning out. Shaq took the stage slowly. No slides. No flashy video package. Just him, hands at his sides, eyes scanning the room like he was about to teach, not perform. He began simply. I'm not here to talk about Wayland Creek. A pause. A few people shifted. Some surprised. But he held them. I'm here to talk about every town that's been trained to smile past its scars. He told them about Ashtonville, not the headlines, but the texture, the whispers, the long glances in grocery stores, the way silence becomes a language in places that claim tradition as their shield. I didn't stay in Ashtonville because it was easy. I stayed because truth is a slow grower. Like oak roots, it takes time to find the cracks beneath polite concrete. He talked about the day of the beer, but not like they'd seen it. He told them what it felt like. The heat on his shoulder, the sound the can made when it bounced on the grass, the stillness in the crowd, the weight of waiting for someone else to do what none of them did. Then he talked about what came after. The kid who lit his candle. The letters left on his doorstep. Ruth's apology. Julius Cade's upload. He spoke about the bench, how building it took less time than healing from the moment that inspired it. He didn't rage. Didn't weep. Just told the truth. Plain and round-edged. You want to know what justice looks like? He asked, looking around the room. It doesn't look like verdicts, or applause, or one man getting shamed while the rest of us go back to brunch. Justice looks like a church mother writing a letter too late, but writing it anyway. It looks like a high schooler choosing truth over popularity. It looks like a business owner rebuilding trust, one sale at a time. Justice is a process, not a prize. The auditorium was silent, hanging on the last words. Shaq leaned forward, gripping the sides of the podium just enough to make the mic hiss. Justice isn't the end. It's the first honest breath after the lie leaves the room. The applause didn't come in a rush. It started slow, hands meeting like people were afraid of breaking the moment. Then it spread, roared, and Shaq stood there for a long beat, not soaking it in, but steadying himself before walking off stage. Later, in a side room filled with fruit platters and filtered water, someone asked him if he thought Ashtonville was fixed now. He smiled, small and knowing. No town gets fixed. They just start telling the truth out loud. By the next morning, clips from the speech were trending. Hashtags returned. Commentators praised him for being measured, masterful. College campuses reached out to book him. Activists quoted his line about the first honest breath. Someone printed it on a t-shirt. Shaq didn't repost any of it. Instead, he flew back home, quietly. The morning after he returned, the gym lights flickered on at the usual time. He showed up early, same as always, unlocking the doors, wiping down the bleachers, letting the familiar smell of rubber and dust and effort greet him like a handshake. He didn't mention the speech, didn't need to. Ashtonville had heard it through enough whispers to know the echo was there. By mid-afternoon, the clouds rolled in low and soft. Not storming, just heavy with the kind of gray that made memories sit closer to the skin. Shaq stepped out for a walk, heading toward the edge of the park. He didn't plan on going to the bench, but his feet knew the way. As he approached, the path curved gently, the grass damp underfoot. The bench stood where it always had, unmoving, unpolished, permanent in its quiet way. But this time, it wasn't empty. A little white boy sat on it, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Freckles, denim overalls, shoes untied. He was swinging his feet, not bored, just passing time. On the ground beside him was a small backpack, a juice box peeking out. Shaq slowed, gave space, not wanting to startle him. The boy noticed, looked up. They locked eyes. No words. Then the boy did something simple. Something so small it might have gone unnoticed on any other day. He smiled and nodded. Just once. Shaq nodded back. The boy turned back toward the field, like nothing had happened. Shaq stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the scene before him. Two people, sharing the same world for a moment. No questions, no history lessons, no explanation, just a bench, and a breath, and enough stillness to feel something change. Then he turned and walked home. No fanfare, no cameras, just the sound of leaves in the wind and the soft crunch of gravel under his boots. The bench stayed behind him, still, strong, waiting. And in that quiet shared world, justice breathed. Not finished, but finally started. Fade out. If this story moved you, don't just sit with it. Sit in it. Talk about it at your table. Question the quiet. Challenge the comfortable. Change doesn't start with noise. It starts with noticing. Because every town has its Ashtonville. And maybe, you're the one meant to light the first candle.